Hello everyone, welcome to What If Issei Was Abandoned by His Family and Had Powers of Abyss of Chaos movie. Before we start, please go support El Diablo Carmesai 666 for writing that awesome fanfic. This is the translated version I made. There will be some mistake in character's gender, but of course Issei is a male. Follows the life of Issei Hyoudou, a young devil who, despite being part of a powerful family, is constantly rejected and mistreated by his parents and siblings due to his lack of power. After being humiliated and scorned, Issei decides to leave hell and flee to the human world, leaving behind his only friends, Rias, Gremory, and Sona, Sitri. Far from home, Issei discovers that he possesses an ancient power sealed within him, the Abyss of Chaos, a primordial cosmic force capable of altering reality itself. However, this power comes at a high cost. Every time he uses it, Issei risks losing his humanity and succumbing to chaos. As he travels the world, seeking to understand and control this power, Issei faces powerful enemies who seek to take advantage of his ability. The story follows her struggle to master her power while trying not to lose her identity and humanity. Throughout her journey, she faces dilemmas about using power, sacrifice, and controlling her destiny, while discovering what it means to be truly strong in a world filled with darkness. Chapter 1: The Last Night at Home 1. The Hyoudou Mansion, located in one of the darkest regions of hell, was the perfect refuge for those who wished to be forgotten. The high stone walls, ornate columns, and endless hallways were the visible face of a family that had been respected for generations. But for Issei Hyoudou, that grandeur only represented the weight of a life in which he never fit in. The mansion was filled with echoes. Echoes of whispered conversations, of doors slamming shut behind him, of mocking laughter that followed him wherever he went. But Issei couldn't hear those laughs like anyone else would. To him, they were the invisible murmurs of doom, the constant reminder that he would never be good enough to be a part of the family that had brought him into the world. Despite his demonic blood, Issei had nothing that made him special. His brothers, Kaito and Ryuji, were perfect in every way. Kaito possessed a devastating sacred gear that granted him untold power, while Ryuji, his younger brother, had been blessed with the power of a rare Languinos, a demonic ability that few could wield. Both of them were feared and respected not only in hell, but throughout the entire demon world. But he had nothing. Throughout his life, comparisons between him and his brothers became inevitable. While Kaito and Ryuji were trained in the arts of demonic fighting and ancient magic, Issei was left aside, his efforts to prove himself always met with the same response: utter disdain. That night, like so many others, Issei found himself alone in his room, staring out the window of the west wing of the mansion. Outside, the torrential rainstorm reflected the chaos he felt in his heart. Kagami, his father, and Lilith, his mother, no longer spoke to him like they used to. His mother's gazes were filled with sadness, but he always felt helpless. His father, on the other hand, treated him like a useless dog, a being whose only purpose was to be a stain on the blood of such a powerful family. Issei. His mother's voice brought him out of his thoughts. Issei didn't look at her immediately. He knew this conversation wouldn't be any different. He knew what he was going to hear. Issei, your father is right. You can't continue to be a burden on our family. You have to start accepting who you are. Lilith's voice was soft, but it had the edge of a sentence that pierced him. Issei slowly turned around, meeting his mother's gaze. Lilith's eyes weren't cold like his father's, but that sadness in her gaze tore at him more than any harsh words Kagami could have said to him. Mother, I want to be something more. I want to be strong. I want something that makes me feel like I'm not just a shadow in this home. Lilith closed her eyes, her expression softening. I've given you everything I can, Issei. But hell does not forgive the weak. Your lack of power makes you a threat to our family, and in this society, threats must be eliminated. His mother's words hit him like a slap in the face. Issei lowered his head, feeling the weight of disappointment crushing his chest. It wasn't the first time he heard words like that. So what should I do, mother? Die as a failure? Issei's voice trembled. He knew his mother didn't want him dead, but those words were the ones that hurt him the most, the recognition that, in her eyes, he would never be enough. Lilith did not respond immediately, she just sighed. I'm sorry, my son, but this is the fate that has befallen you. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Issei alone in the dim light of his room. At that moment, a torrent of emotions overflowed inside him. Anger, sadness, shame. Everything mixed together in a cocktail that drowned him. He stood up from his chair and walked to the window, looking at the torrential rains of hell that lashed the horizon. His family had abandoned him emotionally, and he was trapped in a golden cell, with no chance of escape. But then an idea crossed his mind, an idea as risky as it was liberating. What if he ran away? He didn't know if he would be accepted in the human world, or what the future held for him, but he couldn't go on living like this, without dignity, without purpose. With a determination he had never felt before, he stood up and left his room. That night would not be like any other. That night, Issei Hyoudou would leave hell. Issei had decided that he would leave, but before he left, he had to say goodbye to the only two people he truly cared about in that vast and lonely hell. Rias Gremory and Sona Sitri. Although they were both from powerful families, they had always been kind to him. Although their power and status were infinitely greater than Issei's, they never treated him like a piece of junk, never looked down on him. On the contrary, he found comfort in them. She headed to the back garden, where Rias was waiting for them. The space was a quiet place, far from the formalities of the castle. Rias, with her fiery red hair, was sitting on one of the fountains that adorned the garden, looking up at the starry sky. Sona, more reserved, was reading a book near a tree. Issei felt a pang in his heart as he saw them. He knew that if he said goodbye, he might never see them again. But what hurt him the most was that he couldn't continue being a burden to them, a burden that they would always have to save. Rias, Sona. Her voice was low, trembling. Both girls looked at him, surprised. Rias was the first to stand up. Issei, what's wrong? She asked, her tone worried. Sona, closing her book, looked at the young man. She knew something was wrong. I'm going to leave. I can't keep living there. I can't keep being a burden on my family. I don't know what will become of me, but I need to do this. Issei spoke quickly, as if the words might escape before he changed his mind. Rias walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. Issei, you can't be so hard on yourself. We know what you've been through, but running away isn't the solution. Sona, her glasses reflecting the moonlight, nodded slowly. We support you, Issei, but that doesn't mean you have to leave like this. You will always be welcome here, in our home, in our lives. Issei clenched his fists, feeling the emotion overflow. But he knew his decision was made. I can't stay. I can't be what they expect of me. I don't want to be the weak one anymore. Rias smiled sadly at him. You understand, right? It's not your power that matters, Issei. It's your heart. Never forget that. Sona, though reserved, also smiled softly. We will miss you, but we will always be your friends, no matter what happens. With those last words, Issei nodded and, with a look full of gratitude, turned around. Before he left, his eyes filled with tears. Thank you. I will never forget it. The door closed behind him, and the weight of goodbye weighed heavily on his chest as he used an ancient spell to open a portal to the human world. A portal that would take him away from hell and, perhaps, to an uncertain future. Rain fell on Issei as he stepped through the portal into the human world. A cool wind surrounded him as he crossed the border between two worlds. He felt the moisture of the earth beneath his feet, and the human city, though distant, offered him a strange feeling, freedom. Something he had never experienced in his life in hell. As the portal closed behind him, Issei felt his chains, invisible but present, slip away. Life in hell was oppressive, a golden prison that never allowed him to be himself. Now, before him, a future that was uncertain, but also full of possibilities, opened up. He found himself in a coastal town, the sound of waves crashing against rocks mixed with the distant noise of the city. Lights flickered in the distance, and the city was bustling with activity, despite the storm raging through the region. Issei looked out at the horizon and took a deep breath. He knew that life in this world would be different, but he had no idea how to start. How would he survive? He had abandoned everything, his family, his home, and his identity as a son of the Hyoudou. Now, he was just a lonely demon in a human world, powerless and with little more than his memories. Suddenly, a warm air current surrounded him, and the instant he felt that breeze, a dormant power within him began to awaken. Issei stopped in his tracks. The sensation was strange, almost as if something was calling out to him from within, something powerful, something he had never felt before. He didn't know if it was an illusion, or if something had truly changed within him. But what he felt wasn't normal. Without warning, Issei felt an unknown energy coursing through his body. The power was growing, something he couldn't control, and in his desperation, he let himself go. At first, it was a gentle torrent, an internal breeze that filled him with a warm and comfortable feeling. But quickly that energy intensified, like a storm inside him. "What's going on?" he thought, feeling his body vibrate with an unknown power. The air around him began to distort. The lights of the city began to flicker, and the ground beneath his feet began to shake. The power within him was not like any magic he had seen in hell, nor was it something that had anything to do with his brother's sacred gears. It was something more primal, more primal. It was the rage of his being, a power that had been sealed away for his entire life, repressed by his family and his lack of value. Now, that power was beginning to break free. Issei fell to his knees, his body feeling indescribable pain as the energy expanded. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of him. At first, Issei didn't see it clearly, but he could make out a silhouette, a shadow that looked like a mix of light and darkness. "Who?" The figure materialized and, with a single gesture, stopped the storm of energy that Issei had unleashed. The figure was a tall being, with dark hair and bright gem-like eyes. He wore dark clothes, but his presence was so imposing that the very air felt heavier. "Calm down, young Hyoudou," the figure said in a deep, yet gentle voice. "You have unleashed something within you. That power is yours, but it is also dangerous. You have awakened what is within your soul." Issei tremblingly looked at the figure. "Who are you? What's going on?" The figure smiled slightly, though with a sad expression on his face. "I am what you might call a mentor, but in reality, I am only a vestige of your destiny. You have unleashed the power of the primordial demon, an ancient power that has been sealed within you for generations." Issei didn't understand. "Primordial demon? What does that mean?" "It is a power that ancient demons feared. An ability that only the purest of beings can awaken, and one that can destroy even gods if left unchecked. It rightfully belongs to you, Issei. You were born with it." Issei tried to process the figure's words. The primordial devil. A power sealed within him, something that not even his family had told him about. He couldn't understand how, but a part of him felt like everything was starting to make sense. This power was what he had always yearned for, the strength he had sought his entire life. The figure continued. "This power, while incredibly destructive, also comes at a cost. It consumes you from within if you do not learn to control it. What you have unleashed is only a glimpse of its true potential. But if you do not master it, this power could end you before anyone else." Issei slowly stood up, feeling a surge of power run through his body. He couldn't deny what he felt, an unstoppable, overwhelming force within him. "How can I control it?" he asked, now with renewed determination. The figure nodded. "That's up to you. Only you can decide whether to let the power consume you or learn to channel it. But you must know that this power is not something that can be controlled without sacrifice." Issei felt caught between his desire for power and the fear of what this power could do to him. But the feeling of helplessness he had lived with for so long, the humiliation and rejection of his family, were no longer present. Now, he had something worthwhile, his own destiny. "I will do whatever it takes to control this power," he said firmly, his eyes shining with renewed determination. The figure nodded once more, slowly disappearing. "Remember, Issei. This power can destroy worlds. Be careful how you use it." With those words, the figure vanished completely, leaving Issei alone in the human world, with the weight of his newfound power. But at that moment, Issei knew that his life had just taken an irreversible turn. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, dyeing the sky in shades of orange and gold. Issei walked through the deserted streets of the coastal town. He had arrived without a clear purpose, not knowing what to do, or where to go. The feeling of freedom enveloped him, but it also filled him with uncertainty. In hell, all he knew was the cruelty of his family, the constant humiliation of not being powerful enough. Now, in this human world, he had nothing, no friends, no family, no place to belong. Despite everything, something inside him kept him steadfast. He knew that this power, the primordial demon, had the potential to change his life, for better or worse. The mysterious figure that had appeared in front of him had left him a warning. This power could destroy him if he didn't control it. But Issei had no intention of letting something so formidable dominate him. How could he allow something so great to defeat him? As he made his way through the city, he noticed that the people around him seemed to live their lives without a care in the world. It was such a contrast to hell, where tension and rivalry were ever present. Here, in the land of humans, everything seemed simpler, more peaceful. But Issei found it difficult to fit in. He was a devil, a creature born in darkness. How could he fit into such a human world? His mind spun as he walked aimlessly. It was then that, without warning, a sharp pain shot through his chest. He stopped dead in his tracks, bringing a hand to his heart. It was as if the power within him was pulsing, demanding to be released. Dark energy began to pulse within his body, and a torrent of sensations flooded through him. The primordial demon was within him, pushing to get out. "Enough!" he screamed, gritting his teeth, but his body did not respond. The energy continued to grow, causing the ground to tremble slightly beneath his feet. At that moment, he remembered the mysterious figure's words. "This power can destroy worlds." Fear ran down his spine. If he didn't find a way to master this force, what would become of him? What would happen if he let this power take over? Would it destroy the human city? Would it destroy him? "I have to control it. I have to find a way," he thought desperately, but he didn't know how. He had never been taught to handle something like this. He had learned to fight in hell, but this was different. Magic, energy, everything seemed out of reach. The pain increased. Issei fell to his knees, his breathing ragged. A burst of dark energy was released around him, skidding through the air like an unstoppable storm. But in that chaos, Issei felt something. A connection. As if a part of him, a deeper, more primordial part, was beginning to understand how to handle this power. Something inside him resonated with the primordial demon. "Calm down, Issei," he muttered to himself, struggling to maintain control. "I'm not just this. I'm not just power. I'm more." Slowly, with effort and concentration, he began to gather his thoughts. "I am Issei Hyoudou, and I will not let this power destroy me." As he repeated those words in his mind, the dark energy within him began to subside slowly. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the power calmed down. Issei breathed deeply, his chest still rising and falling rapidly. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but something inside him had changed. He had found a shred of control. "I have it, I can control it." It was just a first step, but an important first step. This power could be his, if he learned to master it. At that moment, Issei looked up and realized that he wasn't alone. In front of him, a figure stood, silently watching him. The figure was wearing a dark cloak and a mask, hiding most of his face. "Wow," the figure said, his voice deep. "It seems you managed to control the power a little. But it's not enough." Issei, surprised, quickly stood up, adopting a defensive stance. "Who are you?" he asked suspiciously. The figure smiled behind his mask. "I am someone who knows what it means to have power like yours. And I can teach you how to control it if you truly want to learn." Issei watched her for a moment, feeling a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Why would you help me?" The figure turned around, beginning to walk away. "Because I know what it means to have a power that can destroy you. I will help you, but first you will have to prove that you are ready." Issei didn't hesitate. "I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes." The figure, who introduced himself as Wraith, began training Issei. For the next few days, Issei immersed himself in an arduous and grueling training regimen. Wraith gave him no rest. Each day, Issei must learn to master the energy that resided within him, a power so devastating that it could lay waste to everything if not wielded precisely. Wraith taught him to channel energy through his body, to visualize it as a current that must be kept contained. Issei spent entire days practicing, barely sleeping or eating. With each step, the power within him grew, but so did his control over it. In his training, Wraith revealed to him more about the Primordial Demon, an ancient demonic ability that had been lost over the centuries. It was said that only those with an iron will could awaken this power without being consumed by it. And now, Issei was one of those lucky or unlucky few. As the training progressed, Issei began to understand the true extent of his power. He could create energy blasts with a simple wave of his hand. He could alter the atmosphere around him, disintegrating inanimate objects just by looking at them. It was a power so destructive it was frightening, but Issei also knew that it was his only chance to change his fate. But at the same time, Wraith's warnings followed him like shadows. This power is not just a gift. It is a burden. If you let it get out of control, there will be nothing and no one that can stop you. Wraith repeated it over and over again. Issei understood the gravity of the situation. One afternoon, while training with Wraith in a remote part of the city, a figure appeared on the horizon. Issei frowned as he saw the shadow of someone approaching with a firm step. The person was tall and wore a red cloak, a strange symbol embroidered on his chest. Wraith tensed upon seeing the figure. It seems you've attracted someone's attention, Issei. Issei, however, showed no fear. Who is it? Wraith didn't immediately respond, but the tension in the air increased. One of the most dangerous organizations in the human world. Be careful. The figure came closer, and his presence began to feel even more oppressive. I come on behalf of those who seek to control the power you hold within you, the figure said, his voice deep and resonant. And you, Hyoudou, will be an instrument in our hands. Issei stepped forward, dark energy bubbling within him. I will not be controlled by anyone. And so began Issei's first real battle in the human world. Chapter 2: The Call of Power. The air grew tense, charged with energy and danger. The red-cloaked figure advanced slowly, his smile seeming to promise destruction. Around him, the atmosphere seemed to darken, as if his very presence consumed the light. Issei felt his inner energy respond to the threat, thrashing like a caged animal. It was a visceral, almost instinctive reaction, but Wraith stopped him by raising a hand. Don't act without thinking, Issei, his mentor warned in a deep voice. This enemy is not like the common demons you are used to. Who are you? Issei asked, struggling to control the energy pulsing within him. The man in the red cloak smiled, a cold and calculating gesture. I am Azrael, emissary of the Crimson Order. We have been watching you, Issei Hyoudou. That power you carry does not belong to you. It is a dangerous inheritance that can unbalance this world. Our order exists to prevent such a thing from happening. Wraith stepped forward, standing between Issei and Azrael. So you've decided to intervene after all. Isn't it enough for you to control human magic? Now you want to interfere in the fate of demons as well? Azrael ignored Wraith's comment and fixed his gaze on Issei. You have two choices, boy. You can surrender and allow the order to guard your power, or you can resist and die right here. Issei gritted his teeth, feeling a burning rage ignite within him. He had fled hell to be free, to claim his own destiny. He wasn't going to let another tyrant decide for him. I will not give up, he said determinedly, his voice firm and resonant. This power is mine, and I will control it. Azrael snapped his fingers, and a wave of red energy pierced the ground, shattering the stones and creating a crater a few meters away from Issei. A brave, but foolish response. Without warning, Azrael launched an attack. His speed was inhuman, a red blur moving with the force of a hurricane. Wraith barely had time to react, raising a shield of dark energy that blocked the first blow. Issei, stay focused. This isn't a fight you can win without control. Issei nodded, taking a deep breath as he tried to calm the chaos within him. Wraith had insisted that his greatest enemy was not Azrael, or any other warrior, but the uncontrolled power of the primordial demon residing within him. Azrael launched a second attack, this time heading straight for Issei. The red energy emanating from his hands spread out like a storm of lightning, but Issei didn't back away. Instead, he extended his hand, summoning a black and gold energy barrier that repelled the attack with a boom. Interesting, Azrael commented, with an approving smile. It seems you are not as weak as I thought. Wraith appeared behind Azrael, attacking with a flurry of dark energy blades. Though the attack was swift, Azrael dodged it gracefully, countering with a strike that sent Wraith flying into a nearby wall. Issei took advantage of the distraction to channel his power. He felt the energy flowing through him like a raging river, becoming easier to control. He remembered the concentration exercises Wraith had taught him, visualizing energy as an extension of his will, not an enemy. Now! Wraith shouted, quickly recovering and launching himself back into combat. Issei joined the fight, attacking with a flurry of dark energy spheres. Azrael blocked most of them, but one of them managed to hit him, sending him backwards. Looks like you're not just a rookie after all, Azrael admitted, wiping the blood from the corner of his lips. But you're still a kid playing with fire. Azrael spread his arms, and the red energy around him began to condense into a tangible form, a crimson sword of light that vibrated with terrifying power. Let me show you what it means to have absolute control. The battle intensified. Azrael was a master strategist, using his sword to deliver precise and devastating attacks. Although Issei and Wraith fought valiantly, Azrael seemed to always be one step ahead, anticipating every move and responding with overwhelming force. Issei began to feel the pressure. Despite his training, the power of the primordial demon was still difficult to handle. Every time he tried to release more energy, he felt like he was losing control, as if a part of him wanted to give in to the darkness. Focus, Issei! Wraith shouted, blocking an attack that would have hit his apprentice. You can't let power control you. It's you who must master it. Wraith's words echoed in Issei's mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, ignoring the chaos around him. He took a deep breath, searching for the core of his being, the connection to the power that defined him. When he opened his eyes, something had changed. His aura was more stable, more controlled. The black and gold energy surrounding him was no longer chaotic. It was like a calm fire, powerful but contained. Azrael noticed it immediately. So you're finally starting to understand. But is it enough? Issei took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Azrael. I don't know if it's enough, but we'll find out now. With a speed that surprised even Wraith, Issei attacked. His energy was concentrated into a single devastating explosion that directly impacted Azrael. The blow was so powerful that the ground shook, and the air filled with dust and debris. When the cloud cleared, Azrael was standing, his cloak torn and a satisfied look on his face. Well done, Issei. It seems there is more to you than I imagined. But this is just the beginning. Before he could say anything else, Azrael leapt back and disappeared in a flash of red light. Wraith approached Issei, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've made great progress, but there's still much to learn. Azrael is not an enemy you can underestimate. And if the Crimson Order is after you, you won't have a moment's rest. Issei nodded, his breathing heavy but his gaze determined. No matter how many enemies come, this power is mine, and I will use it to change my destiny. Wraith smiled slightly. Then let's keep training. This is just the beginning. The silence that remained after Azrael's disappearance was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Issei was breathing heavily, his body still shaking from the wear and tear of battle. Although he had managed to contain his power and face the enemy, a feeling of unease took hold of him. This is just the beginning, right? Issei asked, looking at Wraith. Wraith nodded slowly, his expression serious. Azrael didn't come just to test you. The Crimson Order has plans for you, and this confrontation was merely an introduction. They want you to know their power, to know that they are watching you. Issei clenched his fists, his determination burning like a renewed fire. Then I will show them that I will not be intimidated. This power is mine, and I will use it to protect what I care about, even if I don't know exactly what it is yet. Wraith looked at him in silence for a moment before nodding. If that is your decision, then we must continue training. But not here. This place is no longer safe. The journey to the Shadowed Mountains. The next day, Wraith took Issei to a more remote location, the Shadow Mountains, a forgotten region on the human map, hidden among perpetual mists and unfathomable ravines. According to Wraith, this was one of the few places where Issei's power would not be easily detected. The journey was long and tiring. As they advanced, Issei noticed how the environment became more hostile. The trees were twisted, their branches looking like claws trying to catch them. The air was thick and cold, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. "What is this place?" Issei asked, watching the shadows moving through the trees. "A refuge, but also a testing ground," Wraith replied. "Here, the energy of the primordial demon will be put to the test. These mountains are charged with ancient magic, and if you cannot control your power, they will consume you." Issei gulped, feeling the weight of his mentor's words. But he didn't back down. "I'm ready." Wraith nodded and led him to a hidden cave deep in the mountains. The entrance was covered in glowing runes that seemed to be alive, pulsing with a rhythm that echoed in the air. "This will be your training base," Wraith said, pointing to the cave. "Here you will learn not only to master your power, but also to confront the shadows that lurk within you." Issei frowned. "Shades?" Wraith crossed his arms, looking at him seriously. "The primordial demon is not just energy. It is a living force, with its own will. If you want to master it, you will first have to confront it." The first encounter with the primordial demon. That night, Wraith left Issei alone in the cave, telling him that he needed to meditate and connect with the core of his power. Issei sat in the center of the cave, closing his eyes as he tried to calm his mind. Darkness enveloped him, and for a moment, everything seemed to be at peace. But then, he felt something. A whisper. "Do you think you can control me?" Issei's eyes snapped open, and he found himself in a completely different place. He was standing in a vast void, an endless space of darkness dotted with golden sparkles. In front of him, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, powerful being, with twisted horns and eyes that glowed like liquid fire. "So it's you," Issei muttered, facing the primordial demon for the first time. The creature looked at him with a scornful smile. "Do you think you can control me, child? I am chaos, destruction incarnate. I am not something you can control." Issei stepped forward, facing him without hesitation. "Maybe not now. But I have no choice. This power is mine, and I will not let it consume me." The demon laughed, a deep and terrifying sound that reverberated through the void. "Brave but naive. If you really want to control me, you'll have to prove yourself." Before Issei could respond, the ground beneath his feet crumbled, and he found himself falling into an endless abyss. All around him, shadows and lights flashed, showing him fragments of memories, fears, and doubts. The inner challenge. Issei landed in a dark field, surrounded by figures that looked like distorted versions of himself. Each of them glared at him with hatred, their eyes filled with contempt. "Who are you?" he asked, instinctively taking a step back. One of the figures stepped forward, its voice echoing in his mind. "We are your fears, your failures, your doubts. We are everything you tried to bury." Another figure spoke, his tone even more cruel. "You are weak. That is why your family despised you. That is why you run away instead of facing your problems." Issei felt those words strike him like daggers. They were truths he had tried to ignore, wounds that had never fully healed. But he couldn't let them get the better of him. "I'm not weak," he said, clenching his fists. "It doesn't matter what you say. I'm here to change, to be stronger." The figures laughed, a sound that filled him with rage. But instead of losing control, Issei took a deep breath, remembering Wraith's lessons. "I'm not going to run away from you. I'm not going to run away from myself." With those words, the figures began to fade away, one by one, until only one remained, the primordial demon. "Interesting," the demon said, watching him curiously. Maybe there's more to you than meets the eye. But this isn't over yet. The return to reality. When Issei opened his eyes, he was back in the cave, with Wraith watching him silently. What happened? Issei asked, still stunned by the experience. Wraith smiled slightly. You have taken the first step towards facing the primordial demon. But there is still a long way to go. The siege of the Crimson Order. Issei's training continued for weeks. Each day was more grueling than the last, but also more revealing. Issei began to understand his power, to feel it as an extension of himself rather than an alien force. But just as he felt he was making progress, the calm of the mountains was interrupted. One night, as he was practicing his techniques outside the cave, a distant noise caught his attention. Wraith quickly appeared, his face tense. They have arrived. From a distance, Issei could see red lights moving through the forest, like a rapidly approaching tide of fire. The Crimson Order? He asked, preparing for combat. Wraith nodded. I don't know how they found us, but they're coming for you. And they're not coming alone. A dozen figures emerged from the forest, each one enveloped in a crimson aura that radiated power. At the front stood Azrael, with his luminous sword and an arrogant smile. Did you think you could hide forever, Issei? He said, his tone mocking. This time, we won't give you the option to give up. Issei looked at Wraith, who gave him a brief nod. Remember what you have learned. Control your power, and do not let it consume you. With those words, Issei charged into battle, ready to face the Crimson Order and protect the power he was finally beginning to understand as his own. Chapter 3: The Crimson Order. The wind blew hard in the shadowed mountains. The usual calm of the region was broken by the distant sound of hurried footsteps, the cracking of branches, and the hissing of agitated grass. Issei prepared himself for the worst, his senses sharpened by constant training over the past few weeks. The presence of the Crimson Order was like a fog enveloping him, dark and heavy. Ray stood beside him, watching intently. His face, always serene, now showed a barely perceptible concern. The Crimson Order had found their refuge, and they were not here to negotiate. Remember what you have learned, Ray said, his voice deep and confident. It's not just about your physical strength, Issei. It's your control that will make the difference. Issei nodded, though deep down he knew that the upcoming battle would not be like any other. Azrael, the leader of the Crimson Order, was not only formidable in combat, but he also had a dangerous cunning. Issei had faced his power once, but now he was determined to defeat him. The red lights began to draw closer, and soon, the imposing figure of Azrael appeared between the trees. His crimson armor gleamed under the moonlight, and in his hands, the sword of pure energy crackled with an almost blinding intensity. Beside him, the other figures of the Crimson Order walked with a firm step, each radiating a palpable energy that caused the air to grow thicker. Azrael smirked as he saw Issei and Wraith standing ready for whatever was coming. His expression was one of utter contempt. Issei Hyoudou, the child who was abandoned by his family, and now, the target of the Crimson Order. Did you really think you could escape from us? Azrael said, his voice filled with mockery. Issei stared at him, his gaze as hard as steel. Wraith, for his part, remained silent, observing his disciple. It was not the time to intervene yet. It was Issei's time, to see how far his control over the power he carried within him had gone. I'm not going to hide, Azrael, Issei replied, taking a step forward. If you want to fight, go ahead. But I won't give up. Azrael let out a laugh that echoed in the stillness of the night. You don't need to give up. You won't get the chance. With a swift movement, Azrael raised his sword, and the figures of the Crimson Order scattered, taking up positions around them. The air became charged with tension, as if space itself were about to explode. Issei felt his inner power begin to stir, the primordial demon awakening at the threat. He knew he had to control it. Wraith had been clear in his teachings. Control is what will allow you to win, not raw power. Azrael raised his sword, and at that moment, the battle began. The battle begins. Azrael lunged forward, his sword glowing with blinding intensity. Issei reacted quickly, dodging the first strike with an agility he did not possess before his training. However, Azrael's sword passed close by, cutting through the air with deadly speed. Issei felt the vibration of the air and knew he had to move faster if he wanted to survive. At his side, Wraith moved like a shadow, fighting off the members of the Crimson Order who had launched an attack. The warriors' weapons were as sharp as the edge of truth itself, and the crimson glow in their eyes reflected their determination. Despite everything, Wraith seemed to be in control, defending and attacking with precision. Issei, for his part, focused on Azrael, who seemed to be enjoying the fight. Not only was Azrael a formidable fighter, but his power emanated a corrosive energy that destabilized the surroundings, weakening anyone who was near him. Issei concentrated his power, feeling the primordial demon stir within him. The heat of energy began to emanate from his body, but Issei did not let the chaos consume him. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and focused on the feeling of control that Wraith had taught him. "This power is mine," he muttered to himself. He opened his eyes, and a new determination flashed through them. With a swift movement, he launched a series of strikes towards Azrael, using his newfound power to boost his speed. Azrael blocked the first strike with his sword, but Issei didn't stop. Each strike was faster and stronger, driven by the desire to protect what was left of his life. Azrael smiled with an expression full of arrogance. "Not bad, kid. But you still don't know what true power is." With a wave of his hand, Azrael released a destructive energy wave that launched Issei several meters back. The impact sent him tumbling to the ground, and for a moment the world spun around him. But Issei quickly got up, his body in pain but his determination intact. "I will not give up," he said firmly, looking at Azrael. Wraith, who was fighting against the other members of the Order, looked at Issei with a gleam of approval. He knew that the fight had only just begun, but this moment of resistance was proof that Issei was learning to control his power. Issei prepared himself for the next move. The battle was not only in physical combat, but in self-control. Azrael knew this, and that was the true threat he posed to Issei. The fight intensifies. Issei quickly stood up, his breathing ragged but his mind clear. The impact of Azrael's attack had left him momentarily stunned, but he knew he couldn't afford to lose focus. Every second counted, and the battle was now a game of both physical and mental endurance. "I will not let you defeat me, Azrael," he murmured, preparing for the next assault. Azrael, who had been watching with a satisfied smile, undid it upon seeing the resolve in Issei's eyes. "Well, you seem to have some fire in you. But you are still far from understanding the true power that is within your reach." Azrael raised his sword, and the energy around him began to intensify. The sword glowed with a blinding light, while the air grew thick, as if the very atmosphere was being altered by the power of its wielder. Issei, aware of the threat, charged again. But this time, his approach was different. He knew he couldn't continue on speed and brute strength alone. He needed something more, something that connected him to the power that had been awakening within him. The primordial demon wasn't just a resource to be used, it was a part of him, and as such, he must learn to coexist with its power without it devouring him. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, letting the energy of the primordial demon merge with his being, not trying to completely control it, but instead merging with it. It was a strange sensation, as if his body was about to disintegrate, but also incredibly liberating. The power flowing within him was immense, and for the first time, Issei felt it as a natural extension of his will. He opened his eyes, now glowing with an intense golden light. With astonishing swiftness, he dashed towards Azrael, his speed increasing with each step he took. Azrael reacted quickly, raising his sword to block Issei's attack, but this time the energy Issei radiated pushed Azrael back. "Impressive!" Azrael shouted, clearly surprised by Issei's renewed strength. "But you're still far from being my equal." With a swift movement, Azrael unleashed a torrent of dark energy from his sword. Issei, however, was already prepared. With a war cry, he raised his hands and began channeling his own energy, creating a barrier of golden energy that countered Azrael's attack. The resulting explosion was deafening, and nearby rocks shattered under the pressure of the clash of energies. Issei stood tall, eyes shining with determination. The power of the primordial demon was still coursing through his veins, and he now knew how to use it. It was as if the puzzle pieces of his power were beginning to fit together, uniting what had previously seemed like a chaotic force into a precise combat tool. "This is just the beginning!" Issei shouted, running towards Azrael again. Azrael, though shocked, showed no signs of faltering. With a wave of his hand, darkness took over the arena around them, creating tentacles of shadows that lunged towards Issei with the intent of catching him. But Issei was ready. With a swift movement, he formed a sphere of golden energy that destroyed the shadows before they could reach him. The ground vibrated under the unleashed power, and the air grew even thicker. Meanwhile, Wraith was fighting the other members of the Crimson Order. Despite his prowess, there were too many enemies to take on single-handedly. Wraith seemed to be in his element, however, using his knowledge of the dark arts and experience to keep the attackers at bay. Issei, on the other hand, felt the tension rising. Although he was fighting better than ever, he couldn't help but wonder what else Azrael had in his arsenal. He knew that the battle wouldn't last much longer if he didn't find a way to overcome the leader of the Crimson Order. The face of death. Suddenly, Azrael raised his sword once more, and the darkness surrounding him condensed into a terrifying figure, a gigantic shadow, a manifestation of pure destruction. This figure, of colossal proportions, seemed to be made of the same dark energy that Azrael had been channeling throughout the battle. "It's time for you to finish, Issei," Azrael said with a cruel smile. The shadow moved forward, and Issei felt the air around him becoming heavier and heavier, as if his very life was being sucked out by that dark energy. Issei fought the fear that was beginning to take over his mind. He knew he couldn't let himself be defeated, not now that he had managed to connect with his power. He looked at the gigantic shadow, and for a moment, everything stopped in his mind. This is not just power. It is my will, my soul, my right to fight for what I love. With those words echoing in his mind, Issei closed his eyes once more and concentrated. The primordial demon within him was lurking, waiting to be released. And this time, Issei didn't hold it back. On the contrary, he allowed the power to flow unrestricted. From his hands emerged a surge of golden energy so intense that the darkness around him began to dissipate. The shadow that Azrael had summoned disintegrated under the power of Issei, who, with a shout of pure will, launched a direct attack towards Azrael. Azrael raised his sword to block, but it wasn't enough this time. Issei's power overwhelmed Azrael's defense, sending out a shockwave that knocked the Crimson Order leader back. The energy blast sent all of the Order members backwards, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The return of hope. When the dust cleared, Issei remained standing, his body covered in sweat and battle marks, but his gaze was stronger than ever. Azrael and the other members of the Crimson Order were out of the fight, though clearly not completely defeated. Azrael slowly stood up, a furious expression on his face. "No, this isn't over!" he shouted, but his voice no longer held the same arrogance as before. Wraith, who had defeated the other members of the Order, approached Issei, looking at him with a mix of pride and warning. "You did it, but don't be fooled. This is just a bump in the road. The Crimson Order won't give up so easily." Issei took a deep breath, still taking in the magnitude of what had just happened. He had defeated Azrael, at least for now. But he knew that their fight was just beginning. Chapter 4: On the Edge of Darkness. The wind howled in the shadowed mountains as Issei and Wraith returned to the cave. The echoes of the battle still resonated in Issei's mind, the screams, the crimson lights cutting through the sky, and Azrael's mocking laughter. Although they had repelled the Crimson Order's attack, the sense of danger still lingered. Issei entered the cave, his body aching and his emotions running high. Wraith followed closely behind him, his face grave and thoughtful. "You can't keep hesitating, Issei," Wraith finally said, breaking the silence. "That moment of hesitation almost cost us both our lives." Issei stopped, turning to face him. "You think I don't know that?" he replied in a frustrated tone. "But it's not that simple, Wraith. This power, it's not just strength. It's a constant battle against myself." Wraith sighed, crossing his arms. "I know. But the enemy won't wait for you to be ready. You have to find a way to overpower him, or what? Issei interrupted, raising his voice. Or will I end up as just another tool for the Crimson Order? Wraith didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the entrance of the cave and watched the storm that was beginning to form in the mountains. You'll have to make a decision soon, he muttered, more to himself than to Issei. Because they'll be back. That night, as Issei tried to rest, he was once again dragged into the dark space where the primordial demon resided. This time, the void seemed even more oppressive, and the figure of the demon loomed more imposing than ever. Do you really think you can keep me under control? The demon said, his voice booming like thunder. Every time you use my power, I bring you one step closer to darkness. Issei clenched his fists, looking him straight in the eyes. I don't care how many times I have to face you. This power is mine, not yours. The demon let out a throaty laugh, filling the space with a suffocating energy. Look at you, so brave with your words. But when the time comes, you will waste away like everyone else. Suddenly, the scene changed. Issei now found himself on a battlefield, surrounded by corpses. He recognized a few faces: Wraith, Azrael, even his childhood friends, Rias and Sona. They were all there, inert, as darkness enveloped him. This is what awaits you if you don't learn to control me, the demon whispered, appearing behind him. This is your future. Issei fell to his knees, feeling an overwhelming mix of guilt and despair. But then, something inside him ignited. No! He cried, standing up with renewed strength. I will not accept this future. No matter how much it costs me, I will change it. The darkness began to dissipate, and the demon looked at him with a mixture of surprise and amusement. Interesting, but remember, Issei, you haven't won anything yet. The next day, as Issei was reflecting on his encounter with the demon, Wraith appeared with unexpected news. We have visitors, he said, with a slight smile. Issei walked out of the cave to find two figures waiting outside. One was a woman with silver hair and golden eyes, who emanated a serene yet powerful presence. The other was a tall, robust man, wearing black armor that seemed to absorb the light around him. Issei, meet Althea and Darius. They are old allies of mine, and they will be helping us in the fight against the Crimson Order. Althea bowed slightly. It's an honor to meet you, Issei. Wraith has told us a lot about you. Darius, on the other hand, crossed his arms and looked at him skeptically. So this is the guy everyone's talking about. I hope you're as awesome as they say, because we don't have time to waste. Issei felt a pang of insecurity, but quickly hid it. I'll do whatever it takes. The following days were intense. Althea began training Issei in the use of control magic, a technique designed to channel large amounts of power without losing control. The key is in breathing, he explained, as a sphere of energy floated between his hands. You must synchronize your mind and your body. Only then will you be able to master the chaos within you. Meanwhile, Darius subjected him to extreme physical training, pushing him to the limits of his endurance. Power is worthless if you don't have the strength to bear it, she said, pushing him beyond his limits. Although the training was grueling, Issei began to notice a change in himself. His connection with the primordial demon grew stronger, and his abilities grew with each passing day. The following days were intense. Althea began training Issei in the use of control magic, a technique designed to channel large amounts of power without losing control. The key is in breathing, he explained, as a sphere of energy floated between his hands. You must synchronize your mind and your body. Only then will you be able to master the chaos within you. Meanwhile, Darius subjected him to extreme physical training, pushing him to the limits of his endurance. Power is worthless if you don't have the strength to bear it, she said, pushing him beyond his limits. Although the training was grueling, Issei began to notice a change in himself. His connection with the primordial demon grew stronger, and his abilities grew with each passing day. The night in the shadowed mountains was eerily quiet. The group made their way through the dense forest, guided by the faint glow of a magical crystal Wraith held in his hands. This crystal led them to the location of their ally, but also revealed the presence of multiple enemies near their target. I don't like this, Darius said, breaking the silence with his deep voice. If there really is a traitor, they might be waiting in ambush. We know, Wraith replied, not taking his eyes off the crystal. But we have no choice. If we leave our ally in the hands of the Crimson Order, it will be the end. Issei gritted his teeth. The thought of a traitor in their midst made him uneasy, but he knew they couldn't afford to hesitate now. How far are we? Althea asked, walking silently a few steps behind them. Ray stopped dead, lifting the crystal to examine it more closely. We're close. But there's a problem. Issei frowned. What problem? Wraith pointed ahead. In the distance, between the trees, a crimson glow rose on the horizon. The Order has erected a magical barrier around the bastion. Getting in will not be easy. Althea stepped forward, examining the glow from a distance. That barrier is fueled by blood. It is a powerful dark magic, but also fragile. If we find the source, we can destroy it. Then let's not waste time, Darius said, unsheathing his sword. The plan was clear, but its execution required precision and nerves of steel. The group split into two teams to approach the infiltration from different angles. Wraith would lead Darius and Althea towards the surveillance point, while Issei and Auric would move along the western flank to neutralize the detection runes protecting the altar. The forest surrounding the altar was charged with a dark energy that seemed to pulse through every leaf and branch. Even the air had a tangible weight to it, making it difficult to breathe and increasing the feeling of oppression. Keep your senses sharp, Wraith murmured as the group crept through the trees. Every step was calculated, every movement coordinated. The shadows of the night were his best ally, but they also hid unknown dangers. Are these runes as dangerous as you say? Issei whispered to Auric as they both approached the first intersection point. More than you might imagine, Auric replied, his eyes flashing with concern. They are designed to alert the caster if they detect any magical or physical disturbance. Deactivating them without triggering a response is an art in itself. When they reached the first rune, Issei saw it carved into the trunk of a tree. It was a spiral of symbols that glowed with a faint red glow. Auric knelt in front of it, taking out a set of magic tools. Cover me. This will take a few minutes. Issei unsheathed his sword and got into position, his eyes scanning the area for any movement. The tension in the air was palpable. He could sense something watching them, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Suddenly, a cracking sound broke the silence. Issei turned towards the sound, his muscles tensing. From the shadows emerged two hooded figures, their eyes glowing with a crimson glow. They were guards of the Crimson Order, patrolling the perimeter. Trouble? Issei asked quietly, as Auric continued to work on the rune. Deal with them, but do it quickly and quietly, Auric replied, not taking his eyes off his work. Issei nodded, taking a deep breath before moving swiftly. His sword sliced through the air with precision, eliminating one of the guards before he could react. The second guard let out a gasp, but Issei neutralized him with one fluid movement. Are you done yet? Issei asked as he cleaned his sword. Auric looked up just as the rune flashed, and then went out. Done. One less. The duo continued their way to the next rune. Meanwhile, on the other flank, Wraith, Althea and Darius faced their own challenges. There are too many guards in this area, Althea whispered as she looked out at the clearing from behind a bush. Wraith nodded, assessing the situation. We'll distract them. Darius, create a magic explosion on the east side. Althea and I will move to the observation point while they investigate. Darius nodded and raised his sword, channeling his magic into an orb of energy which he launched into the nearby forest. The impact was thunderous, illuminating the area in a brilliant glow. The guards immediately moved toward the noise, leaving the path clear for Wraith and Althea. Come on, Wraith said, moving with the agility of a hunter. Althea followed him, using her magic to silence his footsteps and erase any trace of his presence. When they reached the observation point, they could see the altar from an elevated position. It's more protected than we thought, Althea whispered, pointing to the figures surrounding the altar. Wraith frowned. There were at least a dozen guards, plus a magical field that pulsed with crimson energy. We need Issei and Alric to deactivate the runes before we try anything, Wraith muttered. Meanwhile, Issei and Alric were at the last rune. This one was different from the others, larger, more complex, and surrounded by an oppressive aura. This is the hardest one, Alric admitted as he prepared himself. I'll need time. Issei nodded, but before Alric could begin, a shrill screech echoed through the air. From the shadows, grotesque creatures emerged, beasts with twisted bodies and glowing eyes that seemed to be summoned by the very energy of the barrier. We can't let them stop us now, Issei shouted as he launched into the attack. The creatures were fast and fierce, but Issei used everything he had learned during his training to keep them at bay. Each swing of his sword was charged with the energy of the primordial demon, disintegrating the creatures on contact. Hurry up, Alric! He exclaimed as one of the beasts tried to knock him down. Alric, his face covered in sweat, did not respond. His hands worked quickly, deactivating the intricate rune patterns as the growls of beasts filled the air. Finally, the rune gave off a bright flash and went out. Ready! Alric shouted. Issei nodded and launched one last punch towards the creatures before running towards Alric. Now let's go to the altar. At the meeting point, Wraith watched as the lights of the runes around the altar went out one by one. Well done, he said, preparing his group for the next step. The infiltration had been a success so far, but everyone knew the real challenge was about to begin. The altar of the Crimson Order was a work of dark magic at its finest. A circle of crimson runes burned on the ground, surrounded by pillars carved with ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the center, a black-robed priest raised his hands, reciting a guttural chant that echoed with oppressive force in the air. Around him, a group of acolytes channeled energy into a crystal suspended in the air, which glowed with a reddish, unstable light. Each word of the chant made the light intensify, filling the air with a vibration that seemed to shake reality itself. From the shadows, Wraith watched the scene with a frown. If that ritual is completed, they will release a massive amount of energy from the primordial demon. They could raise everything around them, including these mountains. How do we stop that? Issei asked, his jaw clenched. Wraith pointed at the glass. That is its weak point. If we destroy it, the ritual will collapse. But it won't be easy. Darius scanned the scene, noting the movements of the guards and acolytes. They don't just have guards protecting the altar. That crystal is surrounded by an energy field. We can't just attack it. Wraith nodded, his mind working rapidly. We'll have to split up. Althea, Darius, you two will draw the guards' attention. Issei, Alric, and I will take care of the crystal. Issei looked at Wraith, his expression serious. What happens if we don't arrive on time? Wraith looked at him intensely. Then we'll have to face something that none of us are ready to handle. With the plan decided, the group prepared for the attack. The signal came with a burst of light. Althea raised her hands, summoning a blast of magic that lit up the clearing like lightning. The guards immediately turned toward the source of the attack, allowing Darius to charge at them with his sword wreathed in fire. Over here! Althea shouted, casting more spells to attract their attention. As the guards scattered, Wraith, Issei, and Alric took advantage of the distraction to approach the altar. The priest's chant continued, now faster and more desperate, while the acolytes tried to reinforce the energy field protecting the crystal. We'll have to break the field before attacking the crystal, Wraith muttered, assessing the magical barrier surrounding him. Alric stepped forward, his hands glowing with blue energy as he scanned the layers of the shield. It's a complex enchantment. I need time to dismantle it. Issei stood beside him, wielding his sword. You will have your time. As Alric worked, the acolytes began to cast defensive spells. Fireballs and bolts of dark energy flew towards the group, forcing Issei and Wraith to dodge and counterattack. There are too many of them! Issei exclaimed, knocking down an acolyte with a quick blow. Wraith channeled his own magic, creating an energy shield that deflected incoming attacks. Hold firm. Alric is almost ready. The priest raised his voice, his words resonating with a power that made the air vibrate. The crystal began to glow more brightly, and a crack appeared in the sky, revealing a dark abyss that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "They're running out of time!" Althea shouted from a distance, as she fought off the guards. Alric finally raised his hands, letting out a cry of triumph. "The field is disabled." Without hesitation, Issei charged towards the crystal, raising his sword. But just as he was about to strike, a figure stood in his way. It was the priest, his eyes shining with an unnatural fire. With a wave of his hand, he unleashed a wave of energy that launched Issei backwards. "I will not allow you to interfere!" he roared, his voice booming like thunder. Wraith ran towards him, blocking a second attack with his sword. "Issei, focus on the crystal. I'll take care of it." Issei stood up, brushing the dust off his clothes. The crystal was still floating, now emitting a sharp, piercing sound that made him shudder. "This is up to me," he murmured, concentrating his energy. With each step he took towards the crystal, he felt the resistance of the dark power surrounding him. But he did not retreat. "This ends here!" he shouted, raising his sword. The impact of his blow echoed throughout the clearing, creating a shockwave that knocked everyone present to their feet. The crystal shattered into pieces, releasing a burst of energy that lit up the sky with a blinding glow. When the light faded, the altar was in ruins. The remaining acolytes and guards fled, leaving behind a defeated priest lying on the ground, unconscious. Issei fell to his knees, breathing heavily as he tried to catch his breath. "Did we make it?" he asked, looking at Wraith. Wraith nodded, though his expression was grave. The ritual was interrupted, but not without consequences. That crack that appeared in the sky, something happened before we stopped it. Issei looked up, noticing that the sky still seemed dyed a dark red. A feeling of unease settled in his chest. "What does that mean?" Wraith helped him to his feet, looking out at the horizon. "It means that this is just beginning." As the altar's bonds broke, a deafening sound filled the clearing, like a piercing scream emerging from the depths of the earth. The barrier's crimson glow began to flicker, and the runes carved into the surrounding trees cracked, emitting sparks of magical energy. "Careful!" Althea screamed as the ground began to shake. Issei watched as the light of the barrier fluctuated between bright red and abysmal black. The feeling of oppression in the air intensified, as if magic itself was resisting being destroyed. "The barrier will not fall easily," Wraith warned, helping Alric to his feet while keeping his eyes fixed on the altar. Suddenly, black roots sprouted from the ground, moving like snakes, attacking everyone present. Althea conjured a barrier of light to protect herself, while Darius cut through the roots with his sword, unleashing curses with each blow. "This is part of the ritual," Althea exclaimed. "The barrier is trying to regenerate itself by absorbing energy from the surroundings. If we don't stop it now, it will become even more powerful." Issei felt a surge of dark energy enveloping him. It was as if the barrier was trying to invade his mind, whispering words of despair. "No!" he screamed, clutching his sword as he summoned the power of the primordial demon. The energy within him ignited like a blue flame, enveloping his body and dispelling the roots attacking him. "Issei, be careful not to lose control," Wraith warned, but Issei couldn't stop himself. He advanced towards the altar, each step echoing like a war drum. The barriers seemed to react to his presence, crimson lights swirling around him. The force of his power clashed against the dark magic, creating a storm of energy that illuminated the entire clearing. Suddenly, Azrael's figure appeared as a projection in the center of the altar. "Interesting," he said with a mocking smile, looking at Issei. "The barrier is linked to my will, boy. If you want to destroy it, you'll have to face me through it." Issei gritted his teeth, ignoring Azrael's words as he raised his sword. "I don't need to confront you directly. I just need to get this over with." Althea and Wraith ran to join him, channeling their magic to reinforce Issei's attacks. Darius held off the roots that continued to sprout from the ground, shouting orders to the group to hold firm. "Focus on the core!" Wraith exclaimed. "It's right in the center of the altar!" Issei closed his eyes for a moment, concentrating on the energy flowing around him. He could sense the core of the barrier, a fiery point of energy that pulsed like an evil heart. Without hesitation, he raised his sword, infusing it with the power of the primordial demon. "This is my power! And I will not use it to destroy, but to protect!" he shouted as he launched a devastating slash towards the core. The impact was monumental. A shockwave of blue and red energy spread across the clearing, uprooting trees and disintegrating the roots that attacked them. The crimson barrier exploded into 1,000 fragments, which dissolved into the air like ash. The silence that followed was deafening. The group stood still for a moment, watching as the last lights of the barrier disappeared into the night sky. "Did we do it?" Darius asked, breathing heavily as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. Wraith nodded slowly, though his expression was grave. "Yes, the barrier has fallen, but this is just the beginning." Issei fell to his knees, exhausted but relieved. He felt like he had passed a crucial test, but he also knew that the greatest challenge was yet to come. It was then that a laugh echoed through the air, deep and mocking. "Did you think it would be that easy?" From the shadows, a figure appeared. It was Azrael, his light sword shining with a deadly glow and a triumphant smile on his face. "Always so stubborn, Wraith. But this ends here." Wraith stepped to the front of the group, raising his sword. "Not while I'm still here." Issei stepped forward, looking at Azrael directly. "This is not over." Azrael looked at him with interest. "Ah, the child of the primordial demon. I'm looking forward to seeing how far you can go." Azrael stepped forward, his aura beginning to change. The air around him became thick, almost unbreathable, as if the very essence of death enveloped him. His smile, cold and emotionless, sent shivers down the spines of those present. "So, will you show me what you're made of?" Azrael asked, extending a hand coated in dark energy, which crackled like a spectral fire. Issei tightly gripped the hilt of his sword. Although his body was exhausted from the previous confrontation, the challenge in Azrael's eyes gave him a second wind. "It doesn't matter what you are or who you are. I won't stop." Issei pointed his sword at the fallen angel, his energy beginning to surround him with a crimson glow. Azrael moved first, disappearing in a flash of speed. In the blink of an eye, he appeared in front of Issei, delivering a power-packed punch that shattered the ground around him. Issei blocked the attack with his sword, but the force sent him flying backwards, crashing into a pillar. "Is that all you have?" Azrael laughed as his figure floated a few feet off the ground, shadows spreading out like black wings. Issei stood up, spitting out some blood, but his eyes burned with determination. "Don't underestimate what I can do." The sword in his hand began to resonate, surrounded by flames that seemed to respond to his will. With a war cry, Issei charged again, unleashing a series of rapid attacks that Azrael dodged with precise movements. The sound of steel clashing with energy echoed throughout the place, as sparks lit up the darkness around them. Issei found an opening and launched a downward slash, but Azrael blocked the blow with an energy shield. Impressive, but insufficient. Azrael extended his free hand, and a spear of darkness materialized in it. With a fluid movement, he launched it towards Issei. Issei barely had time to react. He raised his sword and deflected the spear, but the resulting explosion sent him back several meters. The impact left a cloud of dust, and for a moment, everything fell silent. When the dust cleared, Issei was standing, his sword resting on the ground. His body was covered in wounds, but his energy continued to surge. "I won't make it easy for you, Azrael." The ground beneath Issei began to tremble as his aura reached a new level. His crimson flames intensified, mixing with a golden hue that shone like a rising sun. Azrael raised an eyebrow, for the first time showing a hint of surprise. "Interesting. Looks like you still have something to show me." Both combatants prepared for the next exchange, their auras colliding in a spectacle of pure energy that illuminated the ruins of the altar. The battle had only just begun, and neither was willing to yield. Azrael watched calmly, his face expressionless as ever. The energy emanating from his body felt like a storm on the horizon, ready to break loose. Issei was unwilling to give in. Despite his condition, his eyes shone with unwavering determination. "Come on, Issei!" Azrael shouted, his voice echoing with a mix of mockery and defiance. "Show what you've learned." Without warning, Azrael disappeared from his position, moving so fast that his silhouette was barely visible. Issei reacted instantly, unsheathing his sword, which resonated with a dark and powerful energy. He was barely able to block Azrael's first blow, which sent him back several meters. The force of Azrael's attack momentarily left him breathless, but Issei's resistance was stronger than the demon expected. Azrael smiled a cruel smirk. "Don't hold back. Use everything you've got, kid," he said as he turned around, taking distance and observing Issei. Issei closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knew he couldn't just defend himself. He needed to attack, or he wouldn't stand a chance. With a cry of defiance, he focused all of his power into his sword, which began to glow with a blinding intensity. The sword resonated with a primordial energy, a force he had never experienced before. "This is the power of darkness that you granted me, Azrael," Issei shouted. With a ferocious roar, Issei lunged at Azrael, his sword glowing with a dark, redemptive glow. Azrael raised a hand, absorbing the energy around him, and at the same time, his eyes shone with an evil glow. The clash between their forces caused the air to shudder, creating shockwaves that destroyed the ground around them. Issei did not back down, despite Azrael's enormous power. His attacks were fast, direct, but Azrael dodged them with impressive agility, counterattacking with precise slashes of his scythe that cut through the air with the force of a hurricane. The fight raged on, both fighters clashing again and again, exchanging blows so fast that the very ground beneath them began to crack. Azrael, with his cruel and calculating style, left no room for Issei to recover. However, the young exorcist began to adapt, sensing his opponent's patterns and anticipating his moves. "I'm not the same child as before, Azrael," Issei shouted, his voice filled with power. "I'll show you what it means to be the son of Ignis." With that statement, Issei made an unexpected turn, summoning a blast of dark energy that launched Azrael backwards. Taking advantage of the opening, Issei lunged at him, his sword filled with primal energy. Azrael smirked. "Impressive," he muttered before raising his scythe in defense. The clash of their weapons sent out a shockwave that made the battlefield vibrate. Azrael took advantage of the moment to channel a massive amount of darkness and death energy into his scythe, transforming it into a gigantic circle of black energy that launched itself towards Issei at devastating speed. "Die, son of the primordial demon!" Azrael screamed, his voice filled with fury and determination. Issei, exhausted but with an unwavering gleam in his eyes, raised his sword to block the attack. With all his being, he concentrated all the darkness energy he had absorbed and channeled it into his sword, creating a shield of solid darkness. "You won't stop me, Azrael." The clash of energies was deafening, creating a shockwave so strong that it destroyed everything around it. The earth sank and split, the air charged with the vibration of battle. When the cloud of dust cleared, both combatants were exhausted, but Issei was standing, sword still raised, while Azrael, although also wounded, smiled with satisfaction. "You are strong," Azrael said with a soft laugh, as if he was enjoying the fight. "But will it be enough?" Issei, breathing heavily, gritted his teeth. He couldn't give up now. He had to win. And he knew he had one final card he could use. "I will do it!" Issei shouted, raising his sword once more, the glow of his dark energy illuminating his face. Azrael, for the first time, showed a slight concern in his eyes, knowing that the primordial demon child was not going to give up. The fight was far from over. Issei was exhausted, his body aching, but victory seemed within his grasp. Azrael, though wounded, was not willing to give up so easily. His aura, dark and vast like the abyss, continued to pulse strongly, as if the battle was far from over. Azrael's eyes shone with a sinister glow as he recovered from the impacts of the fight. "You have not won, child." His voice was deep, like distant thunder, laden with disdain. "The primordial demon yields to no one." With a roar of fury, Azrael unleashed a wave of dark energy that swept across the battlefield, destroying everything in its path. Issei barely managed to dodge it, but the explosion of power pushed him back, causing him to fall to the ground. The feeling of defeat invaded him for a second. He was exhausted, his strength at its limit, but something inside him, something that had been kept hidden throughout the fight, awakened. He wouldn't give up. Azrael watched him with a mix of fury and curiosity. He had underestimated the young man more times than he could count, but at that moment, something had changed. The darkness surrounding Issei wasn't just power, it was will, an unstoppable force. And Azrael knew it. A being with that determination couldn't be defeated so easily. However, he had no intention of continuing to fight. The fight had been interesting, yes, but he had had enough of it. If Issei thought he could truly defeat him, he was sorely mistaken. Azrael raised his scythe once more, but this time it was not to attack. It was a gesture to retreat. His eyes held a gleam of defiance, but also of menace. "This isn't over, Issei," she said in a low voice, almost as if she were whispering to his soul. "The power of the primordial demon is eternal. No matter what you accomplish today, you won't be able to escape your destiny." Issei glared at him, but also with clarity. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't interested in continuing the fight, not with someone like Azrael. He had given everything he could, and his victory was nothing more than an illusion of power. Azrael was too formidable, and standing there meant certain death. Before Azrael could take the next step, Issei gathered all the remaining dark energy within him, channeling it in a completely new way. A black flash illuminated his body as, with a final effort, he raised his hand towards the sky. "I'm not going to play your game, Azrael," he shouted, and at that moment, a dark portal began to form behind him, absorbed by the darkness that surrounded him. Azrael frowned, realizing too late what was happening. "Where do you think you're going?" he bellowed, his voice now tinged with rage. He wanted to stop him, but Issei's energy was already too advanced. With one last look filled with fury and determination, Issei leapt towards the portal. The gap between the worlds narrowed, and Azrael couldn't help but lunge towards it, but the distance was too great. "We will meet again, child," Azrael roared, as Issei's figure disappeared into the portal. The portal slammed shut, leaving only an echo of darkness where the battle had once been. Azrael, completely frustrated, stood there, staring into the void. He couldn't believe that Issei had escaped from him. Issei fell to the ground with a sigh of relief. He was back in the human world, out of Azrael's reach. His body was exhausted, but he had managed to escape. However, he knew that his fight was not over yet. Azrael would not be so easily defeated, and the shadows of the primordial demon would continue to haunt him. For now, Issei had won, but he knew this was just the beginning. Chapter 5: Issei Escape. The air was heavy and dense as Issei tried to catch his breath, his back leaning against a rock wall deep inside a dark, silent cave. The portal had taken him away from the battle, but he didn't know exactly where. His body was covered in wounds, and every movement was a reminder of the recent confrontation with Azrael. Adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but fatigue was beginning to claim its place. Of course, we're going to expand on the theme of the shelter and give it a deeper feel to reflect the emotions of Issei and the group, as well as the preparations for the upcoming showdown. Here's the improved development. The air was heavy and dense as Issei tried to catch his breath, his back leaning against a rock wall deep inside a dark, silent cave. The portal had taken him away from the battle, but he didn't know exactly where. His body was covered in wounds, and every movement was a reminder of the recent confrontation with Azrael. Adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but fatigue was beginning to claim its place. Issei looked up and examined the place he was in. The cave was wide, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling and the distant sound of dripping water. There was something strangely peaceful about this place, as if the outside world couldn't reach them here. However, he couldn't let his guard down. He knew that Azrael wouldn't give up so easily. Wraith emerged from the portal just before it closed, his figure shrouded in shadow, but with a steady energy that indicated he was still ready for any threat. "You did it," Wraith said, his tone a mix of relief and concern. "But this isn't over, Issei. This place seems safer now, but we can't stay too long." Issei nodded weakly, slumping down onto a rock formation that served as a makeshift bench. His breathing was heavy, and his thoughts were plagued with images of Azrael and the shadows that seemed to follow him even as he escaped. Azrael is much more powerful than I imagined. If I don't get stronger, I won't stand a chance next time. Wraith watched him in silence for a moment before answering, his voice calm but firm. It's not just about strength. It's about control, about mastering the power within you without losing who you are. This place will give us a moment to reflect and regroup, but time is not on our side. While Issei rested, Wraith inspected the cave. It wasn't just any cavern, it seemed to have been used as a shelter by other travelers before. Remnants of extinguished campfires, marks on the walls, and a small stream running through one side of the place suggested that this cave was a well-known waypoint for those fleeing or seeking a hiding place in the mountains. Wraith lit a small fire using dry materials he found, and the soft crackling of the flames filled the space, bringing a bit of warmth and comfort to the cold environment. Issei watched the flames, his mind wandering as his body began to relax slightly. This place, Issei muttered. For a moment, it feels like I'm far away from everything. But I know it won't last. Wraith sat across from him, crossing his legs and watching him intently. You are not wrong. This refuge is temporary, but it can give us what we need, time. Rest, regain your strength. No matter how powerful Azrael is, there will always be a way to confront him. As Issei closed his eyes to meditate, he felt a strange connection to the place. The walls of the cave seemed to whisper echoes of ancient battles and forgotten secrets to him. Fleeting images flashed through his mind, warriors facing shadows similar to the ones he had fought, people struggling to survive in a world that seemed to slowly consume them. A particularly vivid vision made him open his eyes suddenly. In it, a figure similar to him, wielding overwhelming power, was facing a demon enveloped in black flames. The battle was fierce, but the warrior seemed to be fighting not only against his enemy, but against something within himself. Wraith noticed the change in his expression and watched him warily. What did you see? Issei hesitated before answering, his words laden with unease. I'm not sure. But I think someone else was here before. Someone like me, who also carried a power I couldn't control. Wraith nodded slowly, as if he understood more than what was being said. This world is full of stories like yours, Issei. But what matters is not how they began, but how they end. After several hours of rest, Issei began to feel his wounds slowly healing. Thanks to the potions and herbs Wraith had prepared, his body was regaining some of its strength, although it was still far from being in optimal condition. Meanwhile, Wraith placed magical crystals at strategic points in the cave, creating a protective perimeter that would sound a warning if anyone approached. These crystals will buy us some time if the Order finds us, Wraith explained. But we must not rely on them. Once you are ready, we will move. Issei stood up, his sword resting in his hand as he looked towards the entrance of the cave. Wraith's words echoed in his mind, not just strength, but control. He knew that time in this shelter wouldn't be enough to solve all of his problems, but he also knew that every little bit of progress counted. Wraith approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone in this, Issei. Remember that. Issei nodded, feeling a spark of determination ignite within him. He knew that the upcoming confrontation with the Crimson Order was drawing ever closer, but he also knew that with Wraith and the others by his side, he had a chance to turn the tide of the battle. As Issei rested, a blue glow suddenly illuminated the cave. The magic crystal Wraith carried with him began to vibrate, emitting a glow that intensified until it formed the holographic image of Althea and Darius. The connection was unstable, with sparks of magical energy occasionally distorting their figures, but the message was clear: something urgent was happening. Althea appeared first, her expression serene but with concern evident in her golden eyes. Wraith, Issei, he said, his voice firm but with an undertone of urgency. The situation has changed. The Crimson Order has wasted no time following their defeat at the altar. We have detected massive movements of their forces towards the Valley of Echoes. We believe they are attempting to complete a new ritual, one that could have disastrous consequences. Darius appeared beside her, his presence as forceful as ever. Though his face remained stern, there was a flicker of unease in his gaze. This is not just a ritual, Wraith. This time, it seems they are seeking to unleash a much greater energy. According to our sources, the Valley of Echoes is an ancient magical node, a place where magical currents converge and amplify. If they manage to channel that power, they could destroy entire cities, or worse, unleash something we cannot foresee. Issei, still leaning against the wall, looked up upon hearing those words. How close are you to achieving this? He asked, his voice still hoarse from exhaustion. Althea exchanged a quick glance with Darius before answering. We don't know for sure, but the movements of his acolytes suggest they are moving quickly. They have already begun carving summoning runes into the valley floor, and reports indicate they have gathered an artifact that could be the catalyst for the ritual. Darius nodded, crossing his arms as he spoke. That's not the worst of it. We've also received information that Azrael might be personally overseeing this operation. If so, this isn't just an attack, it's a direct challenge to us. They know we're weakened, and they're betting that we won't be able to stop them. The tension in the air was palpable. Wraith clenched his fists as he processed the information, his mind already working on a plan. What kind of defenses do they have? He finally asked, his voice deep and focused. Althea sighed, her face showing a trace of tiredness. The Order isn't taking any chances this time. They've erected a magical shield around the valley, powered by a series of interconnected runes. In addition, there are guards patrolling the entrances and magical sentries that detect any disturbance. It will be much harder for us to infiltrate. What about reinforcements? Darius added. So far, we haven't seen any evidence that they're bringing in additional troops, but it would be foolish to assume they won't. If we're going to do anything, it needs to be fast and accurate. Althea looked directly at Wraith and Issei through the glass, her voice taking on a more personal tone. We can't do this alone. We need you to join us as soon as possible. If we let you complete this ritual, there will be no after. This could be the beginning of the end. Darius, always direct, leaned slightly toward the projection. Issei, I'll tell you straight, I know you're hurt, but we can't afford to hesitate. You carry a power that could be decisive in this battle. We're not here to protect you, but to fight by your side. Are you ready to do whatever it takes? Issei clenched his fists, feeling a surge of determination mixed with the weight of his injuries. He slowly straightened up, his gaze meeting Darius's through the glass. I will do it. No matter what it takes. The message ended with a final flicker of the crystal, leaving the cave in a tension-laden silence. Wraith put the crystal back into his pocket, looking at Issei with a mix of pride and worry. It seems we don't have time to fully recover. We'll move at dawn. The silence that followed Althea and Darius' message left a heavy atmosphere in the cave. Issei, still leaning against the wall, breathed deeply, trying to process the urgency of the situation. Every muscle in his body ached, but the weight of responsibility outweighed any physical exhaustion. Wraith moved with precision, as if the pressure of the moment brought him into sharper focus. He immediately began to unfold a small magical map onto a flat rock, projecting a holographic image of the Valley of Echoes. The valley, with its many entrances, rocky outcrops, and hidden caverns, was marked with glowing symbols representing possible points of interest and known enemy locations. The Valley of Echoes is a treacherous place even under the best of circumstances, Wraith said, pointing to a raised section on the map. Magical echoes amplify every sound, making moving stealthily nearly impossible. Every step, every word, can give us away if we're not extremely careful. Issei looked at the map, his eyes fixed on the markings that indicated the main runes of the ritual. How do we plan to deactivate those runes? He asked, his voice filled with exhaustion, but also determination. Wraith frowned, tracing a circle around the runes with one finger. According to what Althea said, the runes are protected by a magical shield fueled by several sources. We must first identify and neutralize those sources before we can touch the core of the ritual. That means we will have to split up to cover more ground. Issei nodded, but couldn't help but feel a pang of worry. Splitting up always left them more vulnerable, especially when facing an enemy as powerful as Azrael and his Crimson Order. First and foremost, you need to rest, Wraith continued, his tone firmer. If you rush into this in your current state, you'll only be a burden, and we can't afford that. Issei gritted his teeth, knowing that Wraith was right. However, he couldn't help but feel impatient. Every minute they spent recovering was a minute the Crimson Order used to strengthen their position. Wraith, recognizing the internal struggle in Issei's eyes, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Listen, Issei. This isn't just your fight. It's ours. Trust us to handle things while you regain your strength. With a resigned sigh, Issei sat down by the wall and closed his eyes, allowing exhaustion to finally overcome him. While he rested, Wraith got to work. The cave didn't offer much in terms of comfort, but Wraith was a master at making the most of the resources available. He pulled out a set of potions and elixirs he'd been saving for emergencies, carefully pouring them into smaller flasks for easy transport. Each elixir glowed with a unique light, green for healing, blue for magical energy, and red for physical strength. These potions are not infinite, he muttered to himself, organizing them into a small leather bag. We must use them wisely. He then checked his own armor and weapons. His sword, though sturdy, had suffered during the confrontation with Azrael. With meticulous movements, he cleaned the blade and applied an enchanted oil that would increase its resistance to magical energies. He also adjusted the straps on his armor, ensuring that everything was in perfect condition for combat. As he worked, he cast a glance towards Issei. The young man was sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling steadily. Wraith knew that Issei carried a heavy burden, both physically and emotionally, and that he needed this moment of peace before facing the coming storm. When Issei finally woke up hours later, he found Wraith sitting in front of the magic map, drawing lines and writing notes on a scroll. How are you feeling? Wraith asked without looking up. Issei stretched, feeling that although he was still sore, his body had recovered enough to continue. Better. Do you have a plan? Wraith nodded, pointing at the map. I've been working on it. Althea and Darius will be on the northern flank, creating a diversion. In the meantime, you and I will infiltrate through the western side. According to Althea's message, most of the power sources that feed the shield are in that area. Issei leaned forward, studying the map. What if distraction doesn't work? Wraith looked him straight in the eyes. Then we'll have to improvise. But I trust Althea and Darius. They know what they're doing. Before leaving, Wraith insisted that Issei practice some basic movements to make sure he was ready. Although time was limited, every minute counted. Focus, Issei, Wraith said as he blocked a practice strike with his sword. Don't let your emotions control you. Azrael already saw that weakness in you. Don't give him the same chance twice. Issei growled, lashing out harder. Although his movements were strong, they still lacked the precision Wraith sought. It's not about brute force, Wraith continued, stopping the attack with ease. It's about using your power wisely. Every movement must have a purpose. After several minutes of practice, Issei began to understand. His strikes became more precise, and his control over the primordial demon's energy improved slightly. Although he was still far from fully mastering it, he felt like he was taking small steps in the right direction. When it was finally time to leave, Wraith and Issei checked their supplies one last time. In addition to potions and weapons, they carried with them a small amulet that Althea had sent them, designed to temporarily block magic detection. It's not perfect, Wraith warned as he placed the amulet around his neck. But it might buy us enough time to infiltrate before we're discovered. Issei nodded, adjusting the sheath of his sword on his back. Then let's do it. With one last glance at the cave that had served as their temporary refuge, the duo set out towards the Valley of Echoes, prepared to face whatever the Crimson Order had in store for them. The path to the Valley of Echoes was not an easy one. The surroundings seemed gloomy and charged with an eerie energy. As Issei and Wraith made their way through the winding paths leading to the valley, the air grew heavier, as if each breath was a conscious effort. The vegetation grew sparser and more twisted, as if even nature avoided their destination. Tree branches reached up like claws toward the sky, and a gray mist covered the ground, dimming the sunlight and enveloping everything in perpetual twilight. Wraith walked in front, moving with the agility of a seasoned hunter, while Issei followed behind him, alert to any sound. The tension between them was palpable, but neither of them said anything. They both knew that the mission ahead required all of their concentration. When they finally reached the entrance to the Valley of Echoes, a feeling of unease immediately enveloped them. From their elevated position, they could see the expanse of the valley, a landscape of rocks and narrow canyons, with natural geometric formations that seemed to have been deliberately carved. "Here we are," Rias said quietly, stopping beside a large rock that offered them cover. Issei looked around at the scene, feeling a chill run down his spine. In the distance, he could see the Crimson Order's camp. Dark tents and magic torches glowed with a faint red glow. Acolytes moved about, preparing for what was clearly a ritual of great magnitude. "It's bigger than I expected," Issei admitted. Rias nodded, frowning. "The Order spares no resources when it comes to achieving its goals. Whatever they are doing here, we must stop it before it is too late." The Valley of Echoes was no ordinary place. It was known for its magical peculiarity. Every sound, no matter how small, was multiplied and resonated in an endless echo. Even the crunch of a leaf underfoot could be heard like thunder in the distance. Rias turned to Issei, his expression serious. "We must move with extreme caution. Here, even the slightest noise can alert the Order to our presence. If you make a sound, do so deliberately and at a controlled time." Issei nodded, trying to calm his nerves. The weight of the mission was even more intense due to the characteristics of the valley. Every step would have to be calculated, every movement precise. As they descended into the valley, Rias used a magical signal to contact Althea and Darius. A small flash of blue light appeared in the air, and moments later, they saw their allies waiting for them behind a rocky outcrop. "You arrived just in time," Althea said, her voice low but filled with relief. Darius, as always, stood alert, his sword resting on his shoulder. "The situation is complicated," Darius growled, pointing towards the enemy camp. "They have guards patrolling every entrance, and at least a dozen acolytes focused on the main runes. Plus, there's a magical shield protecting the runes, meaning we can't just storm in and destroy them." Althea took out a small crystal that projected a detailed map of the valley and the enemy positions. "The shield is powered by 3 energy points that are distributed around the camp. We need to deactivate those points before we can touch the core of the ritual." Rias nodded, studying the map carefully. "So, the strategy is clear. We will create a diversion on the northern flank to draw out the guards, while Issei and I infiltrate through the west to deactivate the energy points." Darius smiled, tapping his sword against his gauntlet. "Perfect. I like nothing more than causing a little chaos." Althea gave him a warning look. "This isn't a game, Darius. If we make too much noise, we might attract reinforcements before time." I know, Darius replied, though his tone suggested he was enjoying the challenge. When the plan was clear, the group split up. Althea and Darius headed to the northern flank, while Rias and Issei advanced west. The path was dangerous, with loose rocks and dry branches threatening to give away their presence at every step. Issei tried to control his breathing, keeping his movements as silent as possible. He could feel the sweat building up on his forehead as every crunch of the leaves beneath his feet echoed like a drum in his mind. Rias, for his part, moved with unperturbed calm, stopping occasionally to survey the terrain and make sure there were no guards nearby. When they finally reached the first energy point, Issei felt a surge of relief which was quickly replaced by tension as he saw that it was guarded by 2 acolytes. "Let me handle it," Rias whispered, pulling a small enchanted knife from his belt. With quick, precise movements, Rias slid towards the acolytes. Within seconds, they were both unconscious on the ground. "Quickly, work on the power point," Rias said, pointing to a pedestal that glowed with a dark red glow. Issei approached the pedestal, sensing the dark energy emanating from it. Concentrating, he began to channel his own energy to neutralize the pedestal's magic. The process was exhausting, but eventually, the glow from the pedestal faded, leaving only an eerie silence in its place. "One down," Rias said. As they headed towards the second power point, the atmosphere began to change. The air became colder, and a thick fog began to rise, making visibility difficult. "This isn't natural," Issei muttered, looking around in concern. Rias nodded, his sword ready in case of a surprise attack. It's a magical defense. The Order knows we're here. Suddenly, a shrill screech broke the silence, and several hooded figures emerged from the mist. They were no simple acolytes, but elite warriors of the Crimson Order, each wielding weapons that glowed with dark energy. Looks like things got complicated, Wraith said with a tight smile. Issei unsheathed his sword, feeling the energy of the primordial demon begin to awaken within him. Then let's do it quickly. The fight was brutal and chaotic. The fog made it difficult to see the enemies, and the echoes of screams and clashes of swords made it almost impossible to determine where the next attack was coming from. Issei moved quickly, blocking attacks and countering with precise strikes. Every time his sword connected, he felt the dark energy of his enemies dissipate, but he also felt his own dark energy grow, threatening to overflow. "Don't lose control!" Wraith shouted as he knocked down one of the warriors. Issei gritted his teeth, focusing on keeping his mind clear. He knew that if he allowed the primordial demon to take control, he would not only endanger the mission, but Wraith and the rest of the group as well. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the remaining warriors retreated, and the fog began to dissipate. "That was too close," Wraith said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Issei nodded, his breathing ragged. "But we did it. Let's keep going." When they finally reached the third and final power point, time seemed to have stopped. The lights in the enemy camp began to flicker, indicating that Althea and Darius were fulfilling their part of the plan. Wraith and Issei positioned themselves in front of the final pedestal, aware. By the time Issei and Wraith reached the heart of the camp, the air was so heavy that it seemed like every breath required a deliberate effort. The main runes glowed brightly, projecting columns of crimson light into the sky. A guttural murmur echoed through the air, like a distant echo of thousands of voices uttering the same chant. In front of them, a group of acolytes formed a circle around a dark energy core, feeding it with magic channeled from the runes. In the center, an emissary of the Order stood with a black spear in his hand, his figure shrouded in pulsating shadows that seemed to devour the light around him. "I knew you would try to interfere," the emissary said, his voice ringing with an unnatural timbre that reverberated in Issei's ears. "But it doesn't matter. Your effort is useless." Wraith tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, sizing up his opponent. "Issei, take care of the acolytes. I'll distract the emissary." Before Issei could respond, Wraith had already charged towards the center, engaging the emissary with a direct blow that was easily stopped by the black spear. "Is that all you have, Wraith?" the emissary taunted, countering with a move that unleashed a blast of dark energy, forcing Wraith back. Issei rushed towards the acolytes, feeling the energy of the primordial demon respond to the pressure of the moment. Every step he took echoed like a drum in the valley, and every swing of his sword cut through the magic shields of his enemies. The acolytes began to cast defensive spells, forming barriers of fire and lightning that tried to stop him. Issei tore through them with a mix of brute force and precision, taking down each acolyte one by one. "I will not let them complete this ritual," he shouted, his voice filled with determination as he faced the last acolyte, who attempted to cast one final spell before being struck down. With the acolytes neutralized, the runes began to fade away one by one, weakening the energy core. Meanwhile, the battle between Wraith and the emissary had reached a critical point. Each clash of sword and spear produced explosions of energy that lit up the camp. The emissary moved with superhuman speed and strength, combining physical attacks with blasts of dark magic that kept Wraith on the defensive. "You are strong, but you are also weakened by your compassion for these worthless mortals," the emissary said, pushing Wraith back with a forceful blow. Wraith, panting, raised his sword once more. True strength comes not from darkness, but from the will to protect others. The emissary let out a mocking laugh, raising his spear towards the sky. A black lightning bolt descended, enveloping him in an even more sinister aura. "Then prove it." With the acolytes defeated, Issei ran to join Wraith. Seeing the emissary's aura, he knew it wouldn't be an easy fight. "Wraith, you can't face him alone." Wraith nodded, with a tired smile. "Then don't let me do it." The emissary looked at Issei with contempt. Ah, the child of the primordial demon. I've heard of you. Let's see if the rumors are true. Issei charged towards the emissary, channeling the power of the primordial demon into his sword. The clash between the two was monumental, sending out a shockwave that knocked down nearby tents and extinguished the magic torches. The emissary's spear and Issei's sword locked in a fierce duel. Each strike was faster and more violent than the last, with sparks of magical energy flying in all directions. You're strong, but you have no control, the emissary mocked, deflecting a blow from Issei and counterattacking with a side sweep that sent him back. Issei gritted his teeth, feeling the energy within him begin to overflow. He could hear the whispers of the primordial demon in his mind, urging him to unleash his full power. I'm not going to lose control, he shouted, reinforcing his determination. As Issei and the emissary continued their duel, Wraith took the opportunity to attack from a different angle. With a precise movement, he managed to wound the emissary in the side, causing him to stagger for a moment. Now, Issei! Wraith shouted. Issei channeled all of his energy into one final attack. His sword glowed with an intense blue light, and with a battle cry, he unleashed a downward slash that pierced through the emissary's defenses. The impact was devastating. An explosion of light and darkness engulfed the camp, knocking everyone present to the ground and destroying the remaining structures. When the light faded, the emissary was on his knees, his spear broken and his dark aura fading. This isn't over, he murmured before disappearing into a cloud of shadows, leaving only an echo of his laughter in the air. With the emissary defeated and the core of the ritual destroyed, the few remaining members of the Crimson Order fled, leaving behind a ruined camp. Wraith leaned on his sword, panting with the effort. We made it, but just barely. Issei, exhausted, dropped to the ground, looking up at the now clear sky. It was harder than I imagined, but at least we stopped them from completing the ritual. Althea and Darius joined them moments later, covered in wounds but visibly relieved. Good job, guys, Darius said, offering Issei a smile. Althea nodded, looking at the faded runes. We stopped this ritual, but we cannot let our guard down. The Order will not give up so easily. Wraith nodded, looking out at the horizon. This was just a battle. The war is still far from over. Chapter 6: Shadows of Betrayal. The group gathered at the edge of the Valley of Echoes, exhausted but victorious. The light of dawn was beginning to bathe the devastated landscape, casting long shadows from the charred trees and collapsed structures left behind by the battle. Though the Crimson Order had been repelled, tension still hung in the air, as if the darkness they had faced was still watching them from the shadows. Issei fell to his knees, leaning on his sword. His hands shook, not only from physical exhaustion, but also from the mental effort of containing the power of the primordial demon. He felt the weight of every decision, every blow, and every life he had taken in the heat of combat. Are you okay? Wraith asked, approaching carefully. Though his words were neutral, there was genuine concern in his eyes. Issei nodded slowly, looking at the blackened marks on his hands where the magical energy had left visible scars. I'm fine. I just need a moment. Althea knelt beside him, placing a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. You did what you had to, Issei. It's not easy to face an emissary like that and emerge victorious. But remember, what you've done today doesn't define who you are, but who you can become. Issei looked up at her, finding unexpected comfort in her words. Darius, meanwhile, scanned the perimeter, making sure there were no immediate traces of the Order. With his sword resting on one shoulder, he looked back at the group and smiled slightly. We have won this round, but we must not be complacent. The Order will not give up so easily, and we all know it. Wraith nodded, though his gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sky still seemed tinged with an ominous red hue, a reminder of the power they had nearly unleashed. That's true, but we can't keep fighting if we don't regain our strength. This place isn't safe, but we'll find a temporary shelter. For now, we need to rest and regroup. The group began to slowly walk towards a nearby rock formation that offered some natural protection. Issei led the way, though his steps were heavy and hesitant. Each of them was deep in their own thoughts, the silence broken only by the crunch of boots on the dirt and the rustle of the wind through the dead trees. Althea was the first to speak as they climbed a rubble-strewn hill. "Did you notice how the runes resonated louder when we attacked? It was as if the valley itself was alive, responding to the ritual. That's not a common occurrence. This place has a deeper connection to dark magic than we thought." "I felt it too," Wraith replied, frowning. "The Order did not choose this place at random. Its latent energy was likely what allowed the emissary to channel so much power." Darius snorted, though there was a trace of unease in his tone. "Well, it's lucky we stopped it in time. I don't want to imagine what would have happened if they had finished." Issei didn't say anything, but his thoughts were filled with images of the confrontation, the emissary's mocking laughter, the weight of his spear clashing against his sword, and the almost unbearable feeling of the dark energy surrounding him. He clenched his fists, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Eventually, they found a cave that was hidden and deep enough to serve as a temporary shelter. The entrance was covered with vines, which offered some natural camouflage, and the interior was spacious, with a small stream providing fresh water. Wraith was the first to enter, surveying the place carefully before nodding. "This will do for now. We'll take turns keeping watch while the others rest." Althea took out a small magic crystal and placed it in the center of the cave. It emitted a soft light that illuminated the space without drawing too much attention from the outside. "This will help us keep the place protected. Any hostile magical energy will be detected immediately." Darius dropped his sword with a heavy clang, before sitting back against the wall, closing his eyes with a sigh. "I'm not one to enjoy hiding, but I admit we needed this." Issei dropped down near the stream, dipping his hands into the cold water. The refreshing sensation helped him calm down, but his mind was still restless. He could feel the echoes of the primordial demon within him, like a constant whisper that he couldn't ignore. "Are you okay, Issei?" Althea asked, approaching with a worried expression. "I'm just trying to understand what happened," he admitted. "Every time I use this power, I feel like I'm losing a part of myself. And each time, it seems harder to get it back." Althea sat beside him, looking out at the water with a thoughtful expression. "Darkness will always try to consume us, Issei. But the difference is in how we respond. You have something that many don't, people who believe in you. And that may be enough to keep you on the right path." Issei looked at her for a moment before slowly nodding. That night, while the others rested, Issei lay awake, watching the flames of a small campfire they had lit to keep warm. His thoughts drifted back and forth, going over the battle and the emissary's words. Wraith walked over and sat down next to him, breaking the silence with a calm voice. "You can't carry everything by yourself, Issei. What we faced today wasn't just a test of strength, but of will. And you proved that you have both." Issei sighed, letting the weight of the words get to him. "I don't know if I can go on like this, Wraith. Every time I fight, I feel like I'm getting closer to becoming the very thing I swore to destroy." Wraith placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not what you feel that matters, but what you do with that feeling. The Crimson Order wants you to surrender to the darkness. But as long as you keep fighting, they'll never be able to defeat you." Silence filled the cave again, but this time, it was a more peaceful silence. When the first ray of sunlight entered through the cave entrance, illuminating the tired but determined faces of the group, everyone knew that their time of rest was over. Although the battle in the Valley of Echoes had been won, the war was far from over. Althea was the first to stand, checking her weapons and equipment. "It's time to move. The Order won't stop, and neither can we." Issei stood up, feeling a renewed determination within him. He had survived another test, and although the darkness continued to haunt him, he was not willing to give up. Wraith looked at his group with a slight smile, although his gaze remained serious. "Today we rest, tomorrow we fight again. And as long as we are together, we will not lose." With those words, the group left the cave, preparing for what was to come. The light of dawn marked a new beginning as the group entered the forest that bordered the Valley of Echoes. Victory had cost them dearly, but it had also strengthened them. Although the physical wounds had been tended to, the emotional weight of the battle still hung over them like a persistent shadow. Issei walked in silence, his thoughts divided between the confrontation with the emissary and Althea's words about resisting the darkness. Wraith led the way, his senses alert to any unusual movement in the surroundings, while Darius and Althea discussed strategies for the upcoming confrontation. If the Order was unable to complete the ritual, they are likely looking for a place with a similar connection to dark magic, Althea commented, frowning as she looked over a map. That gives us an advantage, Darius replied. We can intercept them before they can regroup, but only if we're fast. Ray stopped and turned to the group, pointing to a nearby clearing. We will stop here for a moment. We need to assess our resources before deciding our next move. The group had settled into the clearing, each member attending to different tasks. Darius was inspecting his sword meticulously, making sure it was in perfect condition after the recent fight. Althea was sitting on a fallen log, adjusting the crystals on her staff and checking the magic maps they carried with them. Issei, for his part, was trying to control his breathing and calm his mind, while Wraith patrolled the surroundings with silent steps, always on the alert. The place seemed ideal for a short break. Surrounded by tall, leafy trees, the clearing offered a clear view of the sky, which was now tinted golden by the first rays of the sun. However, there was something about the atmosphere that didn't fit. Issei was the first to notice. The usual murmur of the forest, the songs of the birds and the buzzing of the insects were completely absent. The only thing that could be heard was the rustling of the wind through the leaves, a monotonous sound that seemed to get louder with each passing second. Wraith? Issei called out softly, his gaze fixed on the trees surrounding the clearing. Wraith stopped, turning his head towards him with a serious expression. I notice, he replied gravely, slowly unsheathing his sword. He's too calm. Althea looked up from her staff, her golden eyes shining with concern. Too quiet? What do you mean? The forest is silent, Wraith explained, his words sharp. There is no life around, not even the hum of an insect. It is as if everything is holding its breath. Darius stopped sharpening his sword and stood up, his gaze scanning the perimeter of the clearing. That's never a good sign. Everyone get ready. The group immediately tensed, taking defensive positions. Althea began channeling her magic, creating a faint blue glow that covered the area like a protective bubble. This should give us some time if anything comes, he said, though his tone betrayed some uncertainty. Suddenly, a rustling sound echoed through the trees, followed by an eerie whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a low, guttural sound, as if the earth itself were speaking in an ancient, forgotten language. Careful! Wraith warned, just as an arrow shot out from the shadows. The arrow embedded itself in a tree trunk just a few feet away, vibrating with a dark energy that seemed to corrode the wood around it. Within seconds, more arrows shot out from the thicket, forcing the group to scatter and seek cover. They found us! Darius shouted, raising his sword to deflect a missile headed his way. Hooded figures began to emerge from between the trees, their black robes decorated with the crimson emblem of the Order. There were at least a dozen of them, each carrying weapons imbued with dark magic. Their movements were precise and coordinated, as if they had studied the group before attacking. Issei felt the energy of the primordial demon begin to stir within him, responding to the impending danger. They are not simple soldiers, he murmured, adjusting his grip on the hilt of his sword. They are organized. Wraith nodded, his gaze fixed on the enemies surrounding them. This is no ordinary ambush. We are being pushed towards something. What do we do? Althea asked, as she cast a spell that deflected a volley of arrows. Hold on for now, Wraith replied, his voice firm. But be careful. This is only the beginning. The tension in the air was palpable as the shadows of the hooded figures moved stealthily through the trees, slowly closing in. Each member of the group knew that a confrontation would be inevitable, but there was something else lurking on the horizon, something none of them could yet foresee. As the last of the hooded figures fell, the group gathered in the center of the clearing, breathing heavily. Their bodies were covered in sweat and wounds, but the relief of victory was quickly cut short by a deep sound that echoed through the air, as if the earth itself were groaning in displeasure. From the shadows of the trees emerged a tall, thin figure, his presence oppressive. He wore a black robe adorned with intricate runes that glowed a deep purple, as if alive. His face was hidden behind a metal mask decorated with engravings that seemed to change with every blink. Around him, the air seemed to distort, charged with a blood-curdling energy. "Impressive," he said, his deep voice resonating like a cavernous echo. Though the words were clear, there was a strange reverberation, as if they were spoken from more than one throat. "I expected nothing less from you." Ray stepped forward, sword firmly gripped. "Who are you?" he asked harshly, his tone hiding the tension he felt in the presence of that being. The figure tilted its head slightly, watching the group like a predator playing with its prey. "I am only an emissary," he replied, his tone laden with contempt. "A humble messenger sent to deliver a message. But before that..." With a wave of his hand, he drew a symbol in the air, and a gigantic magic circle formed beneath his feet, rapidly expanding to surround the group. The energy emanating from the rune was oppressive, thick as lead. Instantly, everyone felt as if their bodies were being crushed by an invisible force, making it difficult to even breathe. Issei staggered, feeling the primordial demon energy within him react violently, as if recognizing the emissary. "What mistake?" he hissed, struggling to stay upright as his legs shook under the pressure. The emissary let out a deep laugh, full of malice and satisfaction. "The mistake of believing that you can change destiny. Every confrontation, every battle you wage against the Crimson Order, is but a link in the chain we are forging. Everything you do, all your victories, bring us closer to our true purpose. And you are but actors in a script we wrote long ago." Althea's eyes flashed with concern as she heard those words. There was something eerily compelling about the emissary's voice, as if every syllable was imbued with a truth they couldn't ignore. "You're lying," he said firmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "We are not mere pawns." The emissary turned to her, tilting his head as if intrigued. "Lying? Oh, my dear, if you only knew how little you understand of the game you're caught in." Wraith gritted his teeth, assessing the situation. He could sense the growing desperation of his group, but he knew that staying here would mean their end. "Althea, we need to get out of here. Can you break the circle?" he asked quickly, holding his sword high, ready for any attack. Althea nodded, closing her eyes as she began to channel her energy. Her hands glowed with a pure white radiance, and small cracks began to form at the edges of the magic circle. "Give me time," he said in a tense voice. Meanwhile, Issei clenched his fists, feeling a rising anger. The emissary's words were like a dagger piercing his pride and determination. "We can't just run away," he shouted, turning to Wraith. "If we let him keep talking, he'll only buy more time for his plans." Darius grabbed him by the shoulder, forcing him to look at him. "Issei, don't be stupid. This isn't a fight we can win now. If we fall here, everything we've achieved will be in vain." The emissary watched the discussion with an eerie calm, as if he were enjoying the spectacle. The fractures are beginning to form," he said with a smile that could be felt even though it was hidden behind his mask. "How I enjoy seeing heroes doubt themselves." Issei gritted his teeth, his hand shaking as he reached for the hilt of his sword. He was tempted to attack, to silence the emissary once and for all. But Darius' words echoed in his mind. If they fell now, it would all be for naught. A flash of light interrupted his thoughts. Althea had managed to open a small gap in the magic circle. "Now!" he shouted, pointing toward the opening. Without a second thought, the group rushed towards the exit. The emissary raised his hand, releasing a torrent of dark energy after them. Although they managed to evade most of it, Issei felt a sharp burn on his arm when one of the blasts grazed him, leaving a black mark that seemed to burn his skin. Finally, they reached a safe area, hiding among the dense undergrowth of the forest. Their breathing was heavy, and they were all covered in dust and sweat. Issei looked at the mark on his arm, feeling a slight pang of fear. "This isn't just a wound," he said in a worried tone. "There's something more to this." Ray stepped closer, examining the mark carefully. "It's a minor curse," he said after a moment, "designed to weaken you over time. Althea, can you help him?" The young woman nodded, standing in front of Issei and channeling a warm light onto his arm. Little by little, the mark began to fade, though it didn't disappear completely. This should stop the effect for now, Althea said, clearly exhausted from the effort. Wraith looked at the group, taking in their state. They were all on edge, both physically and mentally. We have learned something important today, he said finally. The Order is playing a much more complex game than we thought. We need to be more careful, more strategic. Issei nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on the ground. The emissary's voice continued to echo in his mind, filling him with doubt. What if he's right? She asked quietly. What if we're really playing into his hands? Wraith placed a hand on his shoulder, forcing him to look into his eyes. If it is true, then it is our duty to change the rules. No matter how dark their plans are, there will always be a way to fight them. Although Wraith's words were firm, everyone knew that the coming battle would be more dangerous than anything they had faced before. Wraith fixed his gaze on Althea, his eyes communicating an urgency that needed no words. Althea nodded quickly, inhaling deeply as she began to channel her energy into the magic circle that kept them trapped. A bright glow erupted from her hands, enveloping her in a warm, powerful light that contrasted with the oppressive darkness surrounding them. We have to get out of here, Wraith said firmly, his authoritative tone making it clear there was no room for debate. But Issei, with his body still burning with energy and rage building up inside him, couldn't accept that idea. We can't just run away, he exclaimed, stepping forward with his fists clenched. His voice trembled, filled with frustration and dangerous determination. If we let him keep talking, he'll only buy more time for whatever he's planning. Darius watched him with a mix of concern and severity. He took a step towards Issei, placing a firm hand on his shoulder to stop him. Issei, this is not the time to be impulsive, he warned in a serious tone. If we fall now, everything we've achieved up to this point will be in vain. Every battle we've fought, every sacrifice, do you want it all to end here? Issei gritted his teeth, glaring at Darius with suppressed rage. But deep down, he knew he was right. He felt the weight of the choice before him. Stay and fight with a minimal chance of success or retreat to live another day and continue facing the Order with greater preparation. Althea's light began to spread across the magic circle, forming cracks that emitted sparks and crackling sounds, as if the spell was actively resisting her attempt to break it. With each passing second, the magical pressure of the circle intensified, forcing the group to struggle against an invisible weight that seemed to crush their bodies. A little more, Althea said with effort, her hands shaking as she increased the intensity of her magic. The emissary, who had remained silent throughout that exchange, finally let out a guttural laugh, full of mockery and satisfaction. You can try to escape all you want, but it won't change anything. The Crimson Order will always be one step ahead. You're just pieces in a game you don't understand. Wraith could contain himself no longer. He turned towards the emissary, his sword glowing with a faint glow as he raised it in defiance. We may be pieces, but even the smallest pieces can take down a king. The emissary did not respond, but his relaxed posture and the lack of concern in his voice made it clear that he did not consider them a real threat. Finally, with a final flash of energy, Althea managed to break through the magic circle. An opening formed in the barrier, large enough for the group to escape. Now! Althea shouted, pointing toward the exit as she fell to her knees, exhausted from the effort. Wasting no time, the group rushed towards the gap, their hearts pounding as the emissary's spells rained down upon them. Balls of dark energy and bolts of crimson power streaked through the air, illuminating the forest with an ominous glow. Although they managed to evade most of the attacks, Issei felt a sharp burning sensation on his left arm when one of the spells grazed it. A black mark appeared on his skin, burning and painful, but he didn't have time to stop and analyze it. Finally, they reached a safe area, hiding among the dense undergrowth of the forest. Their breathing was heavy, and the silence was filled with the sounds of leaves crunching under their feet and the distant echo of spells dissipating into the air. Is everyone okay? Wraith asked, his voice still tense as he scanned the surroundings for possible threats. Darius nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. We are whole barely. Althea was sitting on the ground, still recovering from the exhausting effort of breaking the magic circle. She looked up at Issei and frowned as she noticed the black mark on his arm. "Issei, let me see that," he said urgently, pointing at his wound. Issei raised his arm with some reluctance, looking at the mark with a mix of confusion and worry. The mark seemed to pulse with a faint glow, as if it were alive. "It's not just a wound, is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Althea shook her head as she placed her hands over the mark, channeling a warm light that seemed to soothe the pain immediately. "It's a minor curse, designed to weaken you over time," he explained as he focused his magic. "I can neutralize it for now, but it won't completely disappear until we have time to treat it properly." Wraith watched intently, his thoughts clearly focused on what had just happened. "This wasn't a coincidence," he said finally, crossing his arms. "The emissary knew exactly where we would be. They set a trap for us, but why didn't they just finish us off when they could?" Darius frowned, his expression hardening. "Maybe they wanted to test our skills or send us a message. Whatever it is, we can't let our guard down." Issei slowly stood up, clenching his fist tightly. He looked at the spot where the emissary had been left, his heart burning with a mix of anger and determination. "This won't end like this," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "No matter how much they try to manipulate us, no matter how much power they think they have, I won't let them win." Wraith approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. His gaze was serious but full of understanding. "I know," he said firmly. "But to win this war, we will need more than strength. We will need wisdom, strategy, and above all, confidence in ourselves and in the group." Darius nodded, his face relaxing a little. "Wraith is right. This is not a fight we can win with brute force. We need to outsmart them." Althea, now standing, added softly. "And we must protect each other. Each of us is a key player in this fight. If one of us falls, we will all suffer." The group nodded silently, each reflecting on their companion's words. Although they were exhausted, physically and emotionally, they knew they couldn't stop. With renewed determination, the group prepared to continue their march. The shadows of the forest enveloped them as they entered deeper into the forest, aware that their mission had only just begun and that the Crimson Order still lurked in every dark corner of the world. But they also knew that as long as they stayed together, there was hope. Issei, his arms still throbbing from the black mark, gritted his teeth and silently swore that he wouldn't let that curse or anything else stop him. It was just another obstacle in the way, and he was determined to overcome it, not just for himself, but for everyone who counted on his strength. The war against the Crimson Order was far from over, but that night, deep in the forest, the group found a fleeting moment of unity and purpose.
Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.